topic today is connecting learners with communities. Now, please be aware that we are presenting the lessons a little bit out of order today because Nicole had to leave. So her lesson was lesson 9. My lesson is lesson 8. The idea here is I wanted to take the cultura model and try to place it within the context of PBLL. And then also, assuming that you are taking at least part of the cultura model as your method for connecting with a partner and doing a telecollaboration, how does the cultura model fit inside your project? So those are the topics I'm going to address. The first thing I'd like to talk about is how is the match between cultura and PBLL? You'll remember this lens. At the center of the lens are the key knowledge, understanding, and success skills that the students are trying to attain. And some of those have to do with the target language, actual communicative skills in the target language. Some of them are more propositional, like knowing about something, and some of them are procedural. How do I work with my fellow learners in groups to make a many-faceted project come together into that final product? The points of intersection between what cultura is trying to achieve and what PBLL is, the essential design elements of PBLL are very similar. In PBLL, you're trying to address one challenging problem or question. Now, cultura doesn't have that kind of designation in so many words. However, we can see clearly that in cultura, the questions and problems that are being raised as points of discussion or comparison between the two sides are challenging because the cultural content is hidden inside them, and the learners are trying to tease out those cultural elements that lie behind the language and lie behind the images, not only behind the language and the images, but behind the very behavior that the students are using in the exchange. I think it's a challenging problem or question when, on the French side, the students send pictures of the exterior of their dormitory or of an empty classroom, while the American students send a picture of the interior of a messy dorm room or a classroom full of students. There is probably a motivating cultural difference there. That's a challenging problem or question, and that is what the students are getting at when they're in their exchange. The idea of sustained inquiry is also present in cultura because the students do not go in and simply do one round of inquiry. Instead, the first round of inquiry will generate further questions that they take back to the classroom. And if they cannot solve that question in the classroom, they will bring more questions back to their partner again and ask for further clarification. Authenticity is obvious. Now, not only are we connecting with native speakers of the language that we're trying to learn, but this points to the use of L1 in the exchange. If L1 is used in the exchange phase, that each student is using that language that they are most comfortable in, then that language is authentic and becomes worthwhile material to take back to the classroom and use as input. In cultura, the notion of student voice and choice is embodied in the teacher's non-interference in the exchange. The teacher does not leap in and guide students to take the discussion in a particular direction. That is up to the students. Reflection is also embodied in the classic cultura model because by way of the target construct of culture is viewed as something that is hidden but that is brought out through the discussions and can only be articulated by the learners themselves when they reflect on their exchange and they keep journals. They say, well, we'll get to this later, but this reflective process is the indicator of their learning. In cultura, we also have critique and revision embodied in this flow between the exchange and the classroom and back to the exchange, where students ideas about language and their hypotheses about cultural motivations are tested, critiqued, and then are subject to revision. The part that is a feature of PBLL that is not so much reflected in cultura is this final public product. So in cultura, in the classic cultura model, we have an exchange between two groups, but they are not focused on creating a public product for consumption in one environment or the other. This is a big difference. So what that means is that if you want to do PBLL, in which that public product needs to be published at the end, then you need to fit cultura inside this larger frame of PBLL, so that you go through an exchange as part of your project. First, you would launch your project, then you would, with the learners, shape the inquiry, decide what kinds of things you are, based on the question or problem that you're addressing, what are the kinds of things that you need more information on? Well, part of that information can be gotten when you conduct the exchange. The results of the exchange then become source material upon which you reflect, and maybe at this point you have to revise your project to fit what happened in the exchange. Then you develop your product. Now, ideally, at this point, you need to reflect and revise again before you finally publish. Some differences, this way of fitting cultura type exchange inside a PBLL model poses some challenges for the original cultura model. You may recall that Nicole said her students were going to create a public service announcement type campaign for use in the French school. So her non-native speaking students are trying to launch a campaign in French for use in the target school. Now, that isn't a traditional cultura type activity. However, if the students conducted an exchange as a way of giving each other information about what needs to go into that campaign, then the cultura model fits very well, because cultura becomes the source, the mine of information that the students use to create that final product, even though the final product is in the target language and so it doesn't exactly fit the cultura model. Okay, so now that we've talked about the fit between PBLL and cultura in general, I'd like to talk about some steps in connecting learners with communities. The first thing is, like I said, fitting the exchange within your project. How does the exchange that you would like to conduct with your partner fit inside that larger purpose of the final project product that you want to create? The next dot is finding a partner and reaching agreement. For those who have experience conducting cultura type exchanges, this is one of the most difficult aspects of the entire thing. Finding a partner, reaching agreement about the purpose, and working out the logistics. Then designing the exchange is also something that's going to be a little bit different if you are trying to fit a cultura model inside a PBLL project, because when you design the exchange, if you're working in a PBLL context, you know that you have that driving question, that problem, and you know that you have a final product that you want to create in order to address that driving question. So in a sense, in a PBLL context, the entire exchange would be more constrained. Whereas in traditional cultura, it's free to move in many different directions. Sabine mentioned how sometimes the discussion takes a new direction, like when a student posted a picture of construction equipment outside the dorm, it morphed into a general discussion of how things are bigger in the US and smaller in France, and sort of the cultural ramifications of that. Okay, next you need to figure out how to execute the actual exchange, and then when the exchange is finished, how to use the results in your project. So let's explore each of these aspects in a little bit more detail. So the first thing I'd like to address is fitting the exchange within your project. And perhaps you can use this presentation later when you're designing your project and you want to make an exchange part of it. First of all, how will the exchange shed light on the challenging problem or question that's at the heart of your project? what stages of the project will have to take place before and after the exchange, because the exchange here is just part of your project. By what means can learners incorporate their gains from the exchange into the public product? And what I mean here is, will the final product be a product that can reflect students, can use students' personal reflections on what they learned? Will the final product have, say, journal entries or blog entries from the students reflecting on what they learned, or will it simply be a poster with factual information or recommendations? You have to think about how they're going to take what they get from the exchange and put it into that public product. And finally, what outcomes are specific to the exchange as distinct from the project? If you conduct an exchange, then that exchange also has its own student learning outcomes that are connected with the conduct of the exchange. Were students active in the exchange? When they reflected on their experience, then do their reflections reveal that they gained cultural awareness? You need to define those outcomes from the exchange rather than putting everything to the end. All right, finding a partner and reaching agreement. The first thing that you need to do when you find a potential partner, which is usually a teacher of a class learning English in another country, you need to agree on your mutual aims for the exchange. So we saw in Nicole's case that she was doing a mirrored project. The French students are creating a campaign for use at Bella Vista, and the Bella Vista students are creating a campaign for use in the French high school. They're trading the same kind of project. Or will there be some other form of mutuality? It definitely needs to go in two directions. You cannot set up your exchange as simply a sort of an extractive enterprise where you're going to get things from the other side, but you're not going to provide something to them. Another really important thing is, what is the place of this exchange in the curriculum? A lot of teachers have had problems when they're happy to find a partner, but that partner cannot give the same status to the exchange in their curriculum that you can. So there have been times when, say, teachers in the US make the exchange a part of their curriculum, but the teacher in the target country can't do that. So they make it an extracurricular activity that their students can participate in voluntarily. This kind of exchange often runs into problems because you have different status of the exchange. You have different motivations on the student's part, and it may not work out. Do you and your partner agree on the policy for the use of L1 and L2 in the exchange? Because you would want to have the same policies in that regard. Now in Cultura, we see that the policy is very clear that in the exchange, students use their native language unless they're quoting from the other language in order to get clarification. But they can feel very comfortable in the exchange because they're using authentic language that is native to them. You need to share your defined outcomes with your partner so that you agree on them. Now, what kind of outcomes would you define for an exchange? And here, when you see this presentation later, when you're doing this lesson, you can follow this link to an article by Byram from England, where he discusses assessing intercultural competence. And he has different aspects of assessing intercultural competence. One of them is students' attitude. Another one is students' knowledge about culture. And the third one is students' ability to interpret and relate. You may recall that Sabine mentioned a student who quoted from the New York Times, in other words, provided a link to an article in the New York Times, but then asked the French counterparts, what do you think about this article about France? So whereas before the exchange, the student might have accepted the New York Times article uncritically, as a result of participating in the exchange, the student became aware that the New York Times doesn't have the last word on French culture. It needs to be placed in perspective. It needs to be interpreted. And so that skill of media criticism came to that student as part of the exchange. That, if that was one of the defined outcomes, it was definitely achieved. All right. Finally, you're going to need to consult with your partner about the means of assessment. So if your students keep some kind of blog or diary, will their students be doing the same thing? You need to reach some understanding about that. Right. Now, logistics in a cultura type exchange can be very tricky. The first thing is calendars. Academic calendars can differ very, very much from country to country. For example, when I'm trying to work out an exchange with China, right around this time in China, all the schools are out because of the New Year holiday. They have a break of several weeks, and they won't be beginning school again till the end of February, while UH, my university, we end classes quite early, in early May, so that we don't have that much overlap in our academic calendar. Then there are holidays within the calendar so that they may have a day off when we don't, and vice versa. So all in all, we need to define the scope of the exchange, within a certain date boundary, and decide, okay, how many exchange forums can we conduct within that time? Not only that, but we need to give time between each exchange session to go back to class and process that stuff that came up during the exchange session. If you have different time zones and different days, then you're not going to be online at the same time, or there won't be as much overlap between your time online. You're going to need to decide how frequently you can conduct the exchange. All right, now, Sabine went into the technological means that her students use to conduct the word association surveys and results. She went into it a very little bit. There are many different technological means that you can use to conduct exchanges. You've got to decide how you're going to present stimuli to the students on either side. For example, how will you administer questionnaires? There's got to be a different questionnaire for each side because the questionnaire is conducted in the student's L1. How are you going to collect the responses and then make the responses available with the results side by side so that the students can compare the results from the questionnaires? And finally, how will the conversation be conducted? Now, in classic cultura, it is conducted in an online forum, which is very good because in an asynchronous format, such as a text-based forum, students have time to consider their language and to be very deliberate in their responses. If you choose a synchronous format, such as a Skype call from class to class or Google Hangout, then not only might students have a hard time digesting, processing the language that's coming to them from the other side in real time, but you sort of it's less structured intrinsically and sort of harder to control. And then how is the conversation going to take place? It is possible to have asynchronous interaction that takes place through voice. If you think that your students shouldn't be writing everything, well, they could be making audio files that are left in the forum, and then they are listening to each other rather than just reading all the time. That's something that you need to figure out. But the default seems to be that they interact asynchronously using text and that they can also insert images. All right, so when you design the exchange, of course, you need to start with the outcomes. Now, in the case of an exchange that fits inside a PBLL scheme, part of the outcome is, did the students gain from the exchange the information that they needed to illuminate the central problem or question, the driving question that you're trying to pursue in your project? You need to define the assessments that will test those outcomes. What sources of evidence will you have to assess whether the student achieved the student learning outcome? Now, in the case of cultura, there are two different products that students produce that the teachers access in order to assess students' attainment of interculturality. One of them is a carnet de bord. This corresponds to, say, a captain's log or a journey log, which is kept in real time during the exchange. And it's reflections on what happened during the exchanges and how that made the student feel. Also, we saw that she uses a blog, which is in the target language, to summarize what happened in class. An alternative method, which is also used in cultura, is a carnet de découverte. Now, that's more of a summative product that's conducted at the end, where the student looks back on the entire experience and says, you know, when we started this exchange, my knowledge base was, you know, something. And then after the exchange, now I feel that I have learned. So it's a single event of reflection that looks at the whole product and talks about what the student has uncovered as a result of the exchange. You'll need to reconcile the available calendar time with goals that are achievable, and you may need to adjust your goals. The goals may be actually quite limited due to constraints. That's okay. You're going to want to include cultura's essential starting elements. So in each cultura exchange, they always have this point of entry doing the word association that we saw or the situational response. So you need to do at least one of those things. Have students compare two images, have students do that word association response, just as an initial kind of surface exploration of cultural differences. Now, as we saw in the cultura exchange, this is not the end. We saw students progressing beyond the initial starting element into the exchange and realizing, hey, those responses that came out regarding banlieue in the word association, those were not the end, because actually in France, we do have banlieues that are luxurious and green like the American ones, but it's the media's association of banlieue with violence that tends to dominate our stereotypical image of a banlieue. And yes, so aside from that initial starting element, you'll want to extend with a comparison of cultural products, such as the images, films, news reports, the results of surveys, and Nicole mentioned the nutritional guidelines from the two countries. You want to observe cultura's principles for scaffolding in the exchange. You'll need to scaffold the reading or viewing of the questionnaire responses and the cultural objects. So what this means is that you need to remind students what they're looking for. They need to, not just to look at the responses, but to analyze and form hypotheses about. So that is something you need to prompt them to do. You need to scaffold students' behavior, their netiquette, and their potential responses to conflict. Get them ready before the exchange for the possibility of conflict and how to deal with it. You need to scaffold the exchange itself by providing prompts and by pushing learners to question, to dig deeper during the exchange, not be satisfied with the first answer. You need to scaffold the reading of the exchange and the emergence of hypotheses to test. This is where class time is critical. Class time is when you are scaffolding the students' reading and understanding of the things that emerged in the exchange, and you are pushing them to form hypotheses based on what came out in the exchange, so that they have a theory about, oh, what are the differences between the two cultures, and they can take those back to the next exchange and say, it seemed to us that in French culture, it tends to, such and so. Do you think that that's the case? They're testing a hypothesis. Finally, you need to scaffold the group summary and synthesis of the patterns that they have observed. When you execute the exchange, you need to refocus on that central question or problem of your project before getting into the exchange itself, so that your students have in mind, we have a need to know certain things that we hope to get out of this exchange. You need to share the targeted outcomes and assessments with the learners before you go into the exchange and say, this is what we're looking for. These are the things we're trying to learn. These are the skills that we're trying to get you to acquire. You need to maintain contact with the partner teacher and check in after each exchange on how they think it's going and what might need to be adjusted. And you need to stay out of the way in the forum or whatever other exchange method you have so that the students can take the initiative. You need to stick to your design. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you won't revise it, but what you need not to do is to forget about why you're there in the first place. You need to help learners cycle the language from the exchange to the classroom and then back again. During class time, you need to do problem solving regarding the language and culture that emerged in the exchange. You need to reflect on learning, and you need to perform assessment. As a simple example, if you have as a goal students learning some communicative skills, then you could, during class, have a quick assessment where you ask students to write down 10 terms concerning nutrition that they learned in the exchange, and that would be a kind of assessment. You need to recap the events in the exchange using the target language. This is the point that people who ask, why do you use the L1 in the exchange? Aren't the students trying to practice the target language? And here's the answer. In the exchange, they use the L1, but as soon as they come back to class, they look at the exchange from a target language point of view. Everything in the classroom, you try to maximize the use of the target language and talk about what happened in the exchange in the target language. And then during class time, you also need to, as Sabine mentioned, plan for the next exchange. And usually that takes the form of, here are the things we still don't understand, or the words that weren't clarified. These are the things we need to ask our partners the next time. Now, using the exchange results in your project is going to mean you have to take stock of what happened in the exchange. Did the exchange illuminate the central problem or question? If yes, then you need to plan how you're going to place that material from the exchange in the project. And when I say plan, I mean you and the learners are working together to talk about that. If the exchange did not illuminate the central problem or question, then you need to revise or reframe, or you can consider making the exchange the whole point of your project. The story of how things broke down, the story of how you weren't able to find what you were looking for, could become the central focus of your project. Finally, when you make your project product, you don't want to think of that project product as simply being a showcase of, here's the language my students learned. No, you're trying to connect to an audience and make a real difference in the world. Then maybe you're going to be using the student's native language in that product. If the audience is local, if you, for example, you want to have your students teach parents about what they learned, you might have to have some English in there. So don't just think of the product as a language demonstration, the students showing what they learned in terms of language. All right. As Sabine mentioned, the exchange is not the only source of information for students. They go out and find articles, data from other sources to compare with what they're hearing in the exchange. Learner reflections are also valuable source material for the project. The project might include, if it's a series of posters, then the poster could show reflective diary entries from students that reveal their process of learning. And don't forget that in PBL, one of the essential things is that the product be of high quality, suitable for a public audience, and so you'll need to do final revisions. Then, when that product is ready, definitely you'll want to go back to your exchange partners and say, look, this is what came out, and you'll want to take pride in that product. So that's what I have to offer for connecting learners with communities. It's tricky to conduct one of these and embed it in a project, but it is possible. Thank you very much.